History remembers empires, it remembers conquerors, it remembers the names that survived. But history also forgets entire kingdoms, entire civilizations, lives that changed the world and somehow disappeared from the stories most of us were taught. I have crossed centuries, not to change history, but to remember it. I have no name. I exist beyond the record. Come with me. What makes a civilization truly powerful? Gold, armies, knowledge, or the courage to refuse surrender? History has answered that question many times, but not every answer survived the pages of our textbooks. Tonight, we travel across kingdoms, across centuries, and across lives that still echo through history. One emperor possessed wealth so immense, historians still cannot measure it. One kingdom stood against an empire and refused to disappear. And one rebellion began with people history believed had no power at all. Different centuries, different worlds, one journey. Come with me.
Before Elon Musk, before Jeff Bezos, before anyone on Earth had ever measured a fortune in billions, let alone trillions, there was a man whose wealth was so vast that the people who witnessed it struggled to describe it in their own language, let alone ours. A man who, according to the accounts that survive him, brought so much gold into one city that he may have altered the value of gold itself across an entire region for over a decade. Historians cannot give you an exact number. The honest ones will tell you the calculation is essentially impossible. But they can tell you something stranger than any number. He may be the only person in recorded history whose generosity alone was powerful enough to visibly move the price of the most important commodity in the medieval world. Not through warfare, not through conquest, simply by giving. A man whose empire stretched across an area larger than Western Europe, who controlled the gold supply of the medieval world, and who briefly appeared, fully formed and impossibly wealthy, on the maps of a continent that had barely known he existed. And 700 years later, economists, historians, and journalists are still arguing about a single question. Was he richer than anyone alive today? The honest answer is more interesting than a yes or no. I have no name. I exist beyond the record. 700 years ago, I witnessed a fortune so vast that historians still cannot measure it. This is the story of Mansa Musa, and it begins, as these stories often do, somewhere almost nobody expects. In the year 1235, in the grasslands of West Africa, a small kingdom did something kingdoms rarely manage. It won decisively. A warlord named Sundiata Keita had spent years building alliances and breaking the power of a rival kingdom that had dominated the region for generations. At the Battle of Kirina, Sundiata's forces triumphed, and out of that victory, a new empire was born, the Mali Empire. What set Mali apart from almost every other kingdom of its era was not its army alone. It was what sat beneath its soil, and more importantly, what its rulers understood about controlling it. West Africa, in the medieval period, held some of the richest gold deposits anywhere on the planet. The goldfields of Bambouk and Bure had been feeding trans-Saharan trade routes for centuries. But it was Mali that learned how to control the routes the gold had to pass through to reach the rest of the world. Mali's rulers didn't just have gold, they had a chokehold on its supply to an entire hemisphere. Add to that a second resource almost as valuable, salt. In the trans-Saharan trade, salt was sometimes weighed against gold, ounce for ounce. Caravans crossed the desert from the north, loaded with salt slabs from mines so remote that, according to one Arab traveler, the buildings in the salt mining town of Tagaza were constructed from blocks of salt themselves, because there was nothing else to build with. Gold flowing north, salt flowing south. Mali sitting across both routes, taxing everything that passed through. By the time the throne passed to a man named Musa, sometime around 1312,
The empire he inherited was already the wealthiest power most of the outside world had never heard of. That was about to change. In 1324, Mansa Musa did something that no ruler of his stature had done in living memory. He left his empire, and he took almost all of it with him. Musa was a devout Muslim. Like every devout Muslim of means, he was obligated to complete the hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his lifetime. But what Musa brought with him on that pilgrimage turned a religious obligation into one of the most talked about spectacles of the medieval world. According to the Arab chroniclers who documented the journey, Musa's caravan included tens of thousands of people: soldiers, officials, enslaved attendants, and an enormous train of camels, some accounts placing the number near 100, each one loaded with gold dust. Here is where the first open question in this story appears, and it is worth sitting with honestly. The exact numbers, the camel counts, the tonnage of gold, the size of the caravan, come almost entirely from second-hand sources, written years and sometimes decades after the fact by chroniclers who never personally weighed a single camel's load. Modern historians treat these figures the way you would treat a legend that almost certainly contains real events wrapped inside exaggerated numbers. The broad strokes are accepted as fact, the precise digits are not. What is not in dispute is what happened when that procession reached Cairo. In July of 1324, Musa's caravan arrived outside one of the great cities of the Islamic world. They made camp near the pyramids of Giza for 3 days before crossing into Cairo itself. What followed, according to the scholar Shihab al-Din al-Umari, who arrived in Cairo not long after and spoke directly with people who had witnessed the visit, was a level of generosity that bordered on reckless. Musa gave away gold constantly, to officials, to scholars, to the poor in the streets. He is said to have commissioned a mosque to be built every Friday of his stay, simply because that was the custom in his own empire, and he saw no reason to stop the habit just because he was a guest in someone else's city. And here is the detail that turned a wealthy ruler's pilgrimage into an economic event that historians can still trace in the price records centuries later. Gold was the backbone of value in the medieval Mediterranean economy. Currencies were pegged to it, prices moved with it, and when Musa flooded Cairo's market with more gold than the city's economy had ever absorbed at once, the value of gold itself began to fall. Al-Umari recorded that the exchange rate for gold against silver dropped noticeably after Musa's visit and did not fully recover for roughly 12 years. It is worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets repeated as settled fact when the reality is more textured. Some modern historians, including economic historian Warren Schultz, have pointed out that gold values in Mamluk Egypt fluctuated for many reasons. The dip after Musa's visit, while real, may have fallen within the normal range of medieval currency volatility, rather than representing a singular catastrophe caused by one man. So which is it? Did Mansa Musa personally break an economy? Or did a wealthy visitor's spending coincide with ordinary market movement that later chroniclers, looking for a dramatic story, attributed entirely to him? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, but what we do know is enough to be remarkable on its own. Whether the disruption was singular or simply pronounced, contemporary observers in one of the great commercial cities of the medieval world watched a foreign ruler's casual generosity visibly move the value of the most important commodity in their economy. That alone tells you something about the scale of what arrived in Cairo that summer. I have walked through 700 years of history, crossed deserts, survived wars. I have seen empires built on gold crumble. I have seen entire empires disappear. And somehow, asking people to subscribe remains the most difficult task. If you already have, thank you. And if you haven't, now, back to the journey. So now we arrive at the question the title promised. Was Mansa Musa actually richer than Elon Musk? Modern articles love to answer this with a number. You will find estimates ranging from roughly $300 billion to over $400 billion in today's money, sometimes pushed even higher. These figures typically come from attempts to convert the estimated tonnage of gold Musa controlled or carried on his pilgrimage into present-day gold prices. Here is why that number deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets. Converting medieval wealth into modern dollars is not really a measurement. It is closer to a metaphor dressed up as math. Musa's wealth was not sitting in a bank account or a stock portfolio. It was distributed across an empire, tied up in land, in tribute systems, in control over trade routes, in the loyalty of regional governors, in enslaved labor. None of which converts cleanly into a single, liquid net worth figure, the way a modern billionaire's stock holdings do. When you ask a historian directly how much Mansa Musa was worth in today's dollars, the most common honest answer is some version of, "It is essentially impossible to calculate with any real precision." But here is the part of this story that actually matters more than the number. And it is the part most viral headlines skip entirely. Mansa Musa's wealth was not just large. It was structurally different from modern wealth in a way that makes the comparison almost meaningless on its own terms. A modern billionaire's fortune, however enormous, exists inside a global financial system measured against thousands of other fortunes, fluctuating with markets that millions of people participate in. Musa's wealth, by contrast, was so dominant within his own economic sphere that when he simply chose to be generous on a single trip, he visibly altered the value of gold itself across an entire region for over a decade. You cannot say that about any modern billionaire's spending habits. Not Musk's. Not anyone's. So perhaps the more accurate frame is not whether he was richer in dollar terms. It is that Mansa Musa wielded a kind of economic dominance that simply does not have a modern equivalent. The modern world does not have single individuals who can move the value of a global commodity simply by being generous on vacation. Most people remember the gold. Few remember what he built with it. Focusing only on the gold misses most of what made Mansa Musa's reign significant. When Musa returned from his pilgrimage, he came back with something arguably more consequential than the gold he had spent. He came back with scholars, architects, and a determination to turn his empire into a center of Islamic learning that could rival anything in the Middle East or North Africa. The result was Timbuktu. Before Musa's reign, Timbuktu was already a functioning crossroads, a place where trans-Saharan trade routes from the north met the river networks of the Niger inland delta. Merchants arrived from Morocco, Egypt, and beyond. Salt came one way, gold went the other. But Musa saw something in Timbuktu beyond its commercial value. He saw a city that could be made permanent, not just a market, a monument. Under his patronage, Timbuktu was rebuilt in stone. The great Sankore Mosque, expanded and formalized during his reign, became the center of one of the medieval world's most remarkable institutions. What grew around Sankore was effectively a university, drawing scholars from across the Islamic world to a city in West Africa that most of that world had barely known existed. By some estimates, Sankore and the schools connected to it may have accommodated over 20,000 students at their height. Scholars came to study Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history. Timbuktu developed its own intellectual traditions, its own networks of correspondence with centers of learning as far away as Cairo and Fez. It was not a provincial outpost absorbing ideas from elsewhere. It was producing its own, and what they produced was written down. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are among the most significant bodies of medieval African scholarship anywhere in the world. Hundreds of thousands of texts covering theology, geometry, medical practice, political philosophy, and astronomy. Many of these manuscripts were preserved by Malian families across centuries of colonial rule, hidden from administrators, moved in secret during political upheaval. As recently as 2012, when armed groups seized control of northern Mali, scholars and community members loaded hundreds of thousands of manuscripts into vehicles and moved them out of Timbuktu by road and river to protect them from burning. People risked their lives to save handwritten documents from the 14th century. That is the measure of what Musa built. The viral version of this story is almost always about the gold flooding Cairo, the crashed economy, the incalculable fortune. Those things are real, but the manuscripts of Timbuktu are what separate Mansa Musa from simply being a very wealthy ruler. Anyone with enough resources can accumulate gold. It takes a different kind of vision to take that gold and convert it into institutions, into scholarship, into a city that for 2 centuries stood as one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. Gold made Mansa Musa famous. Knowledge made his empire matter. There was a second consequence of the 1324 pilgrimage that mattered just as much as the economics, if not more. Before that journey, sub-Saharan West Africa was, to European mapmakers and merchants, close to a blank space. Acknowledged to exist, barely understood, rarely depicted with any real specificity.
After Musa's visit to Cairo, accounts of his wealth and power spread through Mediterranean trade networks and eventually reached European cartographers. By 1375, just over 50 years after the pilgrimage, the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, depicted Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne, crowned, holding a scepter, identified by name as the richest king in the land. It is one of the earliest and most prominent depictions of a sub-Saharan African ruler in European cartography. It exists because one man's pilgrimage made an entire continent's wealth and power impossible for Europe to keep ignoring. For a brief window in the 14th century, the wealthiest, most powerful kingdom most of the medieval Mediterranean world knew about was not in Europe or the Middle East. It was in West Africa. So if Mali was this wealthy, this powerful, and this internationally recognized, the obvious question follows. Why isn't this one of the most famous empires in world history? Why does almost nobody learn this story in school? Part of the answer is what happened after Musa's death, somewhere around 1337. Empires built around a single dominant ruler's competence are often fragile in ways that aren't visible until that ruler is gone. Musa's successors struggled to maintain the same grip on trade routes and regional loyalty that had made the empire so powerful. Over the following century, Mali's territory gradually contracted as rival kingdoms, eventually including the Songhai Empire, absorbed territory and routes that Mali could no longer defend. By the 16th century, the empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior of West Africa had shrunk into a much smaller regional power. The great wealth had dispersed, along with the territory. But decline alone does not fully explain the silence. Plenty of empires that declined are still taught extensively. The deeper answer has to do with written records and who controlled them. Much of what we know about Mansa Musa comes from Arabic chroniclers who interviewed people that had encountered him second-hand, supplemented centuries later by Timbuktu manuscripts and oral tradition preserved by Mali's griots, professional oral historians whose accounts were never prioritized by the European academic institutions that shaped what got taught as world history for several centuries. A civilization's wealth, even wealth large enough to visibly bend the value of gold across a region, is not enough to guarantee a permanent place in popular memory. What guarantees that is whether the people who write the textbooks decide your story matters. For Mali, and for Mansa Musa, that decision was made for most of the last few centuries by people who simply weren't paying attention. I have walked through empires that believed their wealth was permanent. I have stood in markets where the price of gold shifted under my feet. I have watched palaces fall and seen manuscripts survive. The empires that trusted only in gold, the gold eventually left with them. What remained were the words, the questions, the knowledge written down in rooms that no longer exist. Mansa Musa understood something that most powerful men do not. Wealth held is wealth that ends. Wealth built into something larger than its owner is wealth that outlives him. 700 years later, people are still trying to calculate his fortune. So, was Mansa Musa richer than Elon Musk? The honest answer is that the question itself may be the wrong one. Not because the comparison is unfair to ask, but because it tries to fit a 14th century kind of power into a 21st century kind of measurement, and the two were never built to be compared cleanly. What we can say with confidence is this. Mansa Musa controlled enough of the medieval world's gold supply that when he simply chose to be generous on a single trip, an entire regional economy felt it for over a decade. He used that wealth to build one of history's great centers of learning in Timbuktu, manuscripts from which are still being preserved and studied today. And he forced an entire continent that had largely overlooked his empire to suddenly draw it onto their maps, in gold, on a throne, with his name attached. Whether or not a precise dollar figure could ever rank him above the richest man alive today, Mansa Musa's wealth has done something no modern fortune has managed to do. It has outlived every single person who ever tried to spend it. And 700 years later, we are still trying to find a number big enough to contain it. Maybe that is the actual answer, not a number, a kind of wealth that time itself has never quite been able to spend down. That may be the only calculation that actually matters.
Gold built kingdoms, libraries preserved them. But history has taught me that great wealth rarely remains unnoticed for long. 5 centuries would pass. Across the forests of West Africa, another kingdom prepared to defend something far more difficult to replace than gold.
In 1897, British forces entered one of West Africa's most important cities. When they left, the ruler was gone. The palace had been emptied, and thousands of royal objects had begun a journey across the world. Some became museum treasures, some became auction pieces, some became evidence. But the question is not what was taken. Why destroy it? The official answer sounds straightforward. A British party led by acting consul James Phillips attempted to enter Benin territory. The group was attacked on the road. Multiple members of the expedition lost their lives. Britain responded with what it called a punitive expedition, which is a very official way of saying, "We are bringing a lot of guns, and we would like this to sound administrative." And to be clear, the deaths of Phillips' party mattered. That became the trigger. But history has a habit of hiding complexity behind short explanations. And if we want to understand why Benin City was destroyed, we need to understand what Britain was actually walking into. First, Benin was not the modern country called Benin. This kingdom existed in what is now southern Nigeria, and this was not some isolated settlement waiting to be discovered like an unfinished side quest. Benin had rulers, institutions, trade, military power, diplomacy. For centuries, the kingdom built systems strong enough to survive rulers, wars, and changing trade networks. That does not happen accidentally. And then there were the bronzes, which are called bronzes, even though many are actually brass. History naming things badly is apparently a global tradition. Benin developed defensive earthworks, walls, moats, and an urban system that impressed outside visitors. This was infrastructure, not mythology. These objects were not simply decoration. They preserved rulers, ceremonies, authority, memory. Benin was preserving history in metal. So why did tensions build? Trade, mostly trade. Because empires become very interested when valuable resources start moving through places they do not control. By the late 19th century, British officials increasingly wanted greater access to commerce in the region. So if Benin was powerful, why was Britain pushing into it in the first place? To answer that, we need to talk about one man, James Phillips. Phillips was acting consul general for Britain in the region, and before entering Benin territory, he had already been writing about trade, influence, access, and opening the kingdom to greater British control. Those words sound bureaucratic, but bureaucratic language has started a surprising number of invasions. And here is where things get strange. Multiple accounts suggest warnings existed. Benin officials reportedly advised against entering during an important ceremonial period. Warnings that traveling now could create problems. Phillips went anyway. Then came January 1897. Phillips and his party moved toward Benin, and on the road, the expedition was attacked. Multiple members of the group lost their lives. Britain now had something empires have historically used very effectively, a justification. But what exactly was Benin City? Because if Britain launched a full military expedition, the target probably mattered. A lot. European visitors described organized districts, broad streets, large earthworks, complex administration, which creates an uncomfortable question. Why are so many people hearing this for the first time? Benin's earthworks stretched across enormous distances. Some researchers argue they represented one of humanity's largest earthwork systems. Not myth, not legend, engineering. And at the center of this system sat the palace. Not simply a residence, a political machine, a religious center, an archive, a kingdom storing memory. When people hear Benin bronzes, they usually imagine statues. That is only part of the story. Some plaques recorded rulers, some showed military victories, others documented interactions with foreign traders. Many functioned like historical records, except these records were cast in metal. Royal heads represented continuity. Ivory objects represented authority. Court objects reinforced power. Removing them was not only economic, it was symbolic. And after 1897, these objects begin appearing in catalogues, museums, private collections, auction houses. History left paperwork, again. Today, the argument has shifted. The question is no longer, what happened? The question is, what happens now? Supporters of restitution argue, these objects were taken during conquest, return them. Museums often argue, global collections preserve world history, keep them accessible. And this debate matters because the objects are not only art, they are evidence of what Benin was, and evidence of what happened to it.
But there is another question here. One historians still argue about what exactly was lost. Because when people hear about the Benin bronzes, they usually imagine museum objects, metal, art, objects behind glass. But kingdoms are not built from objects. They are built from systems. The palace was not simply where rulers lived. It was administration, memory, religion, diplomacy, production, knowledge. And when military expeditions destroy political centers, the damage rarely stays inside the walls. Records disappear, guild structures weaken, skilled networks fracture, communities reorganize around absence. And absence is difficult to measure. Because history is very good at recording what survives, it is much worse at recording what stopped existing. Today, pieces of Benin exist across dozens of museums and collections. Some have returned, many have not. And the debate has moved beyond simple ownership, because people are now asking different questions. Who gets to tell the story? Who gets to keep the evidence? And what responsibility comes with possession? Supporters of retention argue global museums preserve world heritage. Supporters of return argue preservation does not automatically equal ownership. More institutions now sit somewhere in the middle: long-term loans, shared custody, digital archives, partnership agreements. Which means this story still has no clean ending. Maybe that is why the argument keeps surviving. Not because people disagree about what happened, but because they disagree about what justice looks like after more than a century. The expedition ended in 1897. The consequences did not. And maybe the strangest part of this story is that many of the arguments happening today would have sounded familiar to people living through the expedition itself. Because even in 1897, not everyone agreed. Some British observers celebrated the destruction as necessary. Others described the scale of looting in uncomfortable detail. Newspapers debated it, officials defended it, collectors rushed to acquire pieces from it, and museums transformed war trophies into cultural objects. Over time, the language changed. Expedition became collection, looting became acquisition, possession became preservation. History often does this, not by changing events, but by changing the words used to describe them. Which is why source material matters. Because when you go back to expedition reports, museum records, shipping manifests, auction catalogues and correspondence, you stop looking at one event. you start seeing a chain reaction, an expedition, a market, a redistribution network, a century of ownership disputes. And now, a generation trying to reconstruct pieces of a story spread across continents. Maybe that is why Benin still feels unfinished. Not because historians lack evidence, but because evidence itself became part of the story. And once objects stop being only objects, they become memory, identity, proof. And proof is difficult to ignore. And maybe that is the real reason this story still matters, because the objects survived, the arguments survived, and the questions survived too. If pieces of a civilization remain scattered across the world, when does the expedition actually end?
Kingdoms can be burned, palaces can fall, but history is not written only by kings. Sometimes it begins with people the world refused to see. More than 1,000 kilometers away, another empire believed itself unbreakable. Its greatest challenge would not come from rival kings, but from those it had enslaved. In the year 871, one of the richest cities on earth was overrun and burned by a slave army. Picture this. You're standing on the walls of Basra. Behind you are 500,000 people, merchants, scholars, families, entire lives built across generations. Ahead of you is an army, not knights, not foreign invaders, not a rival empire that had spent decades preparing for this moment. Workers. Men who, just a few years earlier, had been digging salt out of the swamps of southern Iraq with nothing but their hands and the knowledge that tomorrow would be identical to today. Now, they were carrying captured weapons, captured armor, captured horses taken from the soldiers sent to stop them, and they were winning. Basra was one of the jewels of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city of merchants and scholars and libraries packed with knowledge that existed nowhere else on earth. A city whose markets handled more wealth in a single day than most kingdoms saw in a year. Within days, much of it would be in ruins. The force that raised it was not supposed to exist. The empire had created it by accident. And for the next 14 years, the most powerful caliphate on earth would struggle, bleed, and come terrifyingly close to total collapse, trying to stop it. This is the story of the Zanj Rebellion, one of the largest slave revolts in recorded history, a war that nearly shattered the Abbasid Empire, and a story that history almost erased entirely. To understand how a group of enslaved laborers came within reach of destroying a superpower, you first have to understand exactly how powerful that superpower was. By the 9th century, Baghdad was the undisputed center of the civilized world, a circular city designed from the ground up as the capital of an empire, home to perhaps 1 million people at its peak. The House of Wisdom was translating the accumulated knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, and India into Arabic, preserving ideas that would have otherwise vanished from history. Scholars inside its walls mapped the stars, calculated the circumference of the earth, and laid the foundations of algebra. The Caliph sat at the center of all of it, commander of the faithful, ruler of a domain that stretched from Central Asia to North Africa, a political entity so vast and so wealthy that most of the world had simply accepted it as a permanent feature of civilization. From the outside, the Abbasid Empire looked completely invincible. But empires of this scale run on something that rarely appears in official histories. They run on labor, enormous, relentless, and cheap. And by the 9th century, the Abbasid economy had concentrated that labor in the wetlands at its southern edge, out of sight, out of mind, and completely out of control. Put yourself in the picture for a second. You're standing in the salt marshes of Lower Iraq in the year 860. The ground beneath your feet is white, not from frost, from salt, rising up through the saturated earth in thick, crystalline layers. The heat can fry eggs without a pan. The air smells of sulfur and stagnant water. Every hour looks identical to the last. You have been here for years. You will be here until you die. This was the reality for the Zanj, East African men and women, brought from the coastlines of what is now Tanzania and Mozambique, sold in the markets of Basra, and marched into the marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates dissolved into the Persian Gulf. The wealthy landowners of the region had a plan: drain the marshes, clear the salt deposits, and expose the fertile farmland beneath. The profit potential was enormous. The human cost was something they had decided not to calculate. The Zanj worked in gangs, under conditions that free laborers flatly refused to accept. Their compensation? if it could be called that, was a daily ration of flour, semolina, and dates, just enough to survive, not enough to live. They slept in the open. They had no legal standing in the empire's courts, no protection, no mechanism for complaint, and no visible future beyond the swamp. What made this more horrifying was not that it was exceptional, it was that it was normal. The machinery that produced this suffering was so thoroughly embedded in the structure of one of history's greatest civilizations that no one in power appears to have given it serious thought. The Zanj were at the bottom of the world, and the world above them was not paying attention. That was a catastrophic miscalculation. His name was Ali ibn Muhammad, and he arrived in the marshes around 869 with something the workers there had never been offered before: a promise.
Historians still debate who he was. Some sources describe him as an Arab of respectable lineage, others paint a more complicated picture, a man of mixed background who had spent years drifting through the empire, writing poetry, practicing theology, and failing repeatedly to ignite the political movement he believed was necessary. He had already attempted uprisings in Bahrain and elsewhere. They had collapsed. He had kept moving. But when Ali reached the salt marshes and spoke directly to the men laboring there, something was different. He was not a straightforward hero or a simple agitator. He was something more unsettling than either, a man who genuinely believed what he was saying and who understood exactly what the workers needed to hear. He invoked Islamic doctrine. Before God, all believers stood equal, regardless of birth or status. He told them their masters had violated the divine order. He told them the suffering they lived inside was not divine punishment or natural law. He told them it was a crime. And then he told them he would lead them out of it.
Look around you. They built their wealth with your suffering. Stand with me, and we will be free.
In September of 869, the first workers took up weapons. The local governors sent a military unit to deal with the disturbance. It was not expected to take long. The unit was destroyed, every man in it. And in that single victory, the rebellion gained something that changed its entire character. Real
Now
weapons,
we can fight.
taken from real soldiers. Word tore through the marshes like fire through dry grass. Workers who had believed there was no exit from the swamp suddenly saw one, and they moved toward it in numbers that began to alarm the entire region. Ali made a promise to every person who
What
joined
your
him.
hands built will belong to you.
You will own what you labored to create. It was radical, it was simple, and it was working. Within a year, the rebellion had drawn tens of thousands to its ranks. Not only Zanj, but poor free laborers, escaped workers from other regions, and others who had concluded they had nothing left to lose. Every campaign sent to crush the uprising was outmaneuvered, ambushed, or simply overwhelmed. The rebels understood the terrain of the marshes in ways that professional armies trained on open fields could not match. They controlled the waterways. They absorbed every failed counterattack and grew stronger from it. Inside the halls of power in Baghdad, the reports became increasingly difficult to ignore. This was the most powerful
Another
caliphate on
defeat?
earth. A state that had defeated foreign armies, governed millions, and projected power across 3 continents. And yet, the reports kept arriving. Another army destroyed, another commander defeated, another campaign vanished into the marshes. Each failure made the rebellion stronger than it had been before. By 871, the Abbasid court was not merely alarmed, it was afraid. Because by 871, an army of men who had been digging salt 2 years earlier was marching on Basra.
Tonight, the Empire learns our names.
The fall of the city was documented by the Abbasid historian Al-Tabari, whose chronicle remains one of our primary sources for these events. What he recorded does not make comfortable reading. Basra, 500,000 people, centuries of accumulated wealth, a center of Islamic scholarship and commerce, was overrun. Its
Basra
libraries
is falling!
burned, its markets were destroyed, its neighborhoods descended into chaos. Within days, one of the richest cities in the Islamic world had been transformed into a graveyard. Tens of thousands of people died. The rebels who had risen against slavery now held captives of their own. This is one of the most historically uncomfortable truths of the Zanj Rebellion, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Ali's movement was fighting against a specific system that had crushed a specific people, but it was operating within a world where slavery was universal, and it made the same moral compromises that nearly every revolutionary movement in the pre-modern world made. The rebellion was not a clean story, it was a human one. What the fall of Basra told the empire was that this was no longer a crisis to be managed at the regional level. The empire was staring at a war, and remember what made this so shocking. These were not professional soldiers raised from childhood for war. Just 2 years earlier, many of them had been digging salt from the earth under the burning sun of southern Iraq. Now they had forced the most powerful empire in the region into a fight for survival. After Basra, Ali did something that transformed the conflict entirely. He built a capital city. Al-Muqtara, the chosen city, rose in the marshes of southern Iraq as a functioning state. It had walls and markets and a working administration that levied revenue, organized defense, and governed a population that may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. At its peak, the rebel state controlled territory stretching for hundreds of miles across the empire's southern interior. Such news aroused fear in any court official in Baghdad receiving that intelligence. This was no longer a rebellion. It was no longer a riot or a regional uprising. It was a revolution that had achieved what revolutions almost never achieve. It had built something, a new political order, operating openly inside the borders of the most powerful caliphate on earth. The regent, Al-Muwaffaq, the real governing force behind the caliphate at this point, understood the stakes with complete clarity. If enslaved laborers could not only revolt but govern, what did that say about the divine right of those who had always governed them? This was not just a military problem, it was an existential one. Al-Muwaffaq began organizing for a war of annihilation.
This ends now.
The final campaign lasted approximately 4 years. Al-Muwaffaq moved south with a restructured military force, better adapted to the waterways that had swallowed previous armies, and led by commanders who had studied and learned from every previous failure. He was methodical, where earlier generals had been reactive. He cut rebel supply lines before engaging directly. He retook territory piece by piece, rather than gambling on decisive confrontations. He refused to be drawn into the ambushes that had dismantled every earlier campaign. Imagine being inside al-Muqtada as that net tightened. Basra falls back to imperial forces. The city that had seemed impregnable begins to run short of everything: food, medicine, weapons, hope. By 882, al-Muqtada was under siege. Ali fought to the end. Al-Tabari records that he continued to lead sorties from the walls, even as the city's population collapsed from starvation and disease.
We stand together. We fall together.
In 883, the walls were breached. Ali was killed in combat. His head was taken to Baghdad as proof that it was finally over. The rebellion was over, but what it had cost the empire to survive it was staggering. Casualty figures from medieval sources must always be handled carefully. Chronicles of this era routinely inflated numbers for effect, but the scale of the damage is not in serious dispute among modern historians. Entire regions of southern Iraq had been stripped of population. Basra never fully recovered its position as a major commercial center. The economic destruction contributed to a fiscal crisis that would accelerate the fragmentation of Abbasid authority over the following century. And one more thing changed. After 883, the large-scale agricultural slavery that had built the salt marshes, the specific system that had made the Zanj Rebellion both possible and inevitable, effectively ceased to exist in the Islamic world in the same form. Whether that was a direct consequence of the revolt or the result of broader economic shifts remains debated, but the correlation is undeniable. The system that had broken hundreds of thousands of people was gone. The people who had broken it paid a price that can never be fully counted. Which brings us to the question that should be bothering you right now. Why don't we know this story? Spartacus appears in films, novels, school curricula, and cultural memory across the world. The Zanj Rebellion, larger in scale, longer in duration, and arguably more consequential in its historical effects, is known almost exclusively to specialists in medieval Islamic history. Part of the explanation is structural. The primary sources are Arabic chronicles. Al-Tabari's history of the rebellion is detailed and remarkable, but it was not translated into European languages until the modern era, and it never entered the educational canon that shaped how the Western world understood the ancient and medieval past. But structure alone doesn't account for the silence. Spartacus is remembered in part because Rome, the civilization that defeated him, produced the philosophy, law, and literature that formed the intellectual foundation of Western education. Roman writers documented the rebellion because they found it useful. It demonstrated the danger embedded in their system and the strength required to preserve it. The Abbasid historians who recorded the Zanj took a different approach. Al-Tabari does not conceal the revolt, but his framing is consistent. This was treason, catastrophe, a wound inflicted on a righteous order. The rebels appear as a threat to be neutralized, not a movement to be understood. Memory is shaped by who controls the archive. The archive almost always belongs to the side that won. The Zanj lost the war. Their capital was razed, their leader was killed, their movement was crushed, and for more than 1,000 years their story faded into the background of history. But not completely. Because what happened in the marshes south of Basra between 869 and 883 was never a footnote. It was one of the defining human dramas of the medieval world. A story of power, resistance, desperation, and survival. A story of hundreds of thousands of people who looked at the life they had been given and decided that whatever came next was preferable to accepting it. They came closer to bringing down an empire than anyone in Baghdad ever wanted to admit. The empire won the war. The empire wrote the history. And for more than 1,000 years, that history almost worked. Almost.
I have crossed kingdoms, walked among emperors, stood beside rebels, and watched civilizations disappear. Some were remembered for their wealth, others for the courage to resist. All of them deserve to be remembered. History is not only written by those who won. Sometimes it survives because someone refused to let it disappear. Beyond every forgotten name, there is another story waiting, another journey, still unfinished. The farther we travel, the more history begins to look different, and we've only just begun. Until our next journey, keep looking beyond the record.